Welcome back to the show. Today I want to share some thoughts with you on who is your competition? Who is your competition? And as you've watched the shows more than once, I hope, that you're going to see that the Bible is jammed full of examples of a variety of subjects that can help us even 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years later. Now, the temptation to compete can be overwhelming, to be like people around you. That is, to copy and mirror people that are all around you, when in fact you may have been born with certain talents and gifts that can be leveraged for a lot of other people. Years ago, we were driving on a two-lane road heading south, and there were 2 lanes heading north, and there were 2 lanes heading south. And I noticed a truck's trailer separate from the back of his truck, and it was heading right toward us several years ago. My whole family was in the car, and I just yelled, "Hold on," because if you can imagine, the trailer part of this truck was heading right toward us, crossing a few lanes of traffic. I kept my eyes on the runaway trailer, and I really heard nothing around me. I was so focused on that because I saw nothing but the trailer heading right toward us. As it got closer, I swerved at the right moment, and it missed us but hit the car behind us, and I stopped for help. There's times when you and I have to be maybe thrown into a situation because we wouldn't choose to go through that situation on our own. There's times when you're chosen to do extraordinary things in a very, very extraordinary cause. Now think about that in your own life. There's times when you realize that you are unique, and maybe that some higher power may want to expand that uniqueness. Even with your own baggage. All of us have baggage, I'm sure, right? You have baggage? I know I do. There was a guy in the Old Testament named Hosea, and Hosea was very upset that his people in his country were not being ethical and honest. They weren't being too godly. So Hosea was asked to live out an example to the people in his society to live life a little differently, to be more honest, to have integrity, to do things the right way. So the very first thing this is a bizarre story, a very bizarre book in the Bible, but the first thing that he was tasked to do by God was to, I'm going to sound a little obscene or absurd, is that he was tasked to go find a prostitute and marry the prostitute, to be a word picture, an image to the society that this is what the society was doing in that culture. That is, they were involved in activities that were not too pure, that were not too honest. No, I'm not suggesting that you go out and marry a prostitute. I'm not saying that at all. But her life, Hosea's wife's name was Gomer, that she was a very, very clear example to the society about how they have really gone the opposite way of what they should have done. So in the book of Hosea, chapter 3, a paraphrase of it says this: "Then God said to me, go and get your wife again and bring her back to you and love her, even though she loves adultery. For the Lord still loves Israel," which is where he lived, though she has turned to other gods and offered them choice gifts. So I brought her back from her slavery for a couple of dollars and 8 bushels of barley. And I said to her, "You must live alone for many days. Do not go out with other men nor be a prostitute, and I'll wait for you." This is, I mean, shoot, if it was me, there's not even a chance, right? Verse 4. "This illustrates the fact that Israel will be a long time without a king or a prince, and without an altar, temple, priest, or even idols. Afterward, they will return to God and their king, and they'll come trembling and submissive." And so the whole storyline, which is again bizarre. I mean, it's really bizarre. But sometimes in this story, in this context, that a word picture sometimes makes more sense to other people than not. So in Hosea chapter 14, it goes into how God will heal their waywardness, and God will love them lavishly, this paraphrase says, and God will make a fresh start with Israel. Again, the story goes with Hosea was told to marry the prostitute as an example to the people of Israel that God still loved them even though they had done some really bad things. Talk about being unique. Talk about being different. Talk about, setting the bar at a very low level. That was an example, that was a word picture that I don't think I'd be comfortable using consistently. But Hosea was a linchpin. Hosea was an individual that through his actions was able to transform a society in a way that maybe another way would not have worked. There's times when you and I are chosen to do certain things where there's really no competition at all. That is to maybe rewrite the book on whatever you're trying to accomplish. So when you and I strive to become like other people, or when the word is emulate other people, we then ignore our own expertise and or our niche in life. The people that I've seen that have really made it big time have found a niche, or some people call it a niche, and leveraged that niche. They've created their uniqueness and then leveraged that uniqueness. Charles Swindoll, a great author, tells a story. He says, once a spider built a beautiful web in an old house. He kept it clean and shiny so that flies would patronize it. The minute he got a customer, he would clean up on him so that other flies would not get suspicious. Then one day, this fairly intelligent fly came buzzing by the clean spider web. Old man the spider called out, "Come in and sit." But the fairly intelligent fly said, "No, sir, I don't see other flies in your house. I'm not going in there alone." But presently he saw on the floor below a large crowd of flies dancing around a piece of brown paper. He was delighted. He was not afraid of lots of flies if they were doing it. So he came in for a landing. Just before he landed, a bee zoomed by saying, "Don't land there, stupid, that's fly paper." But the fairly intelligent fly shouted back, "Don't be silly, those flies are dancing. There's a big crowd there, everybody's doing it. That many flies can't be wrong." Well, you know what happened. He died on the spot. Listen, Chuck Swindoll says this: "Some of us want to be with the crowd too badly that we end up in a mess. What does it profit a man or a person or a fly if he escapes the web only to end up on glue?" Because other people are doing it doesn't make it right. My father taught me that, or tried to teach me that for a long time. When I was in high school in the 80s, at least in my school, Lansdowne High School, drugs were very prevalent. I mean, they were doing drugs on the bus, they were doing drugs on the school bus, and I just wanted to fit in. They did it at the bus stop. They did it in the bathrooms, they did it behind the school, they did it in the school, they did it everywhere. And because I was the oddball, I was not of the crowd. I just wanted to be with the crowd. Until I realized much later in life, I'm a little dense, maybe you are too, that the people that were doing those things, generally speaking, not all, but some of them didn't turn out so well. Because they developed a habit that continued through their life that ended up to be some very bad things. So when you and I get our eyes on the competition, we ignore the people that life has placed in our lives that could make a difference in our lives. Let me give you another example. In 1984, I was working at a store called Photo First in Columbia, Maryland, at a mall, Columbia Mall. And my boss's name at the time was Sharon. And I was probably by then 18, 19 years old. And I had studied photography in school. I did 3 years of it, shot weddings and other things as a result of that. And I was making X amount of dollars in this photo lab, processing film for people and pictures and this and that. And then one day I got a phone call from another employer that said that they're hiring and that I should come interview with them. So I went and interviewed with them. and I was suckered into accepting the position. I took the position. I believed their hype. So I went back and told Sharon that I was going to go work for this place. I can't even remember the name of the company. And she said, John, you should really think twice about going to work for these people because they're this and that and this and that. Well, I didn't pay attention to what Sharon said. So I went, and like my first day there, I realized that I was in deep weeds. That what they were asking me to do was not something that I thought that they were going to ask me to do. So I crawled back, if you will, to Sharon. I said, Sharon, I really made a mistake. Can I have my job back? And thank goodness she welcomed me with open arms. But what if I would have listened to Sharon, who had way more smarts than I do, and still she's much smarter than me, I'm sure, if I would have listened to her and followed her advice, that she was looking out for me. Again, there are people that are placed in your life, not all, by the way, 10, 20% of the people in your life are placed in your life as a means to help you, as a means of a stepping stone. Why not leverage those people in your life? The time we're losing focus on the people who we think are our competition, we become maybe dragged away from our own development. Think about that a minute. Let me give you a silly example. If you're studying to be a baseball player and you're really passionate about that, and somebody's trying to lead you down a path to be a carpenter, baseball player, carpenter, not quite the same thing, then you'll never really realize your dream of being a baseball player because you're giving into the hype or the talk and the words of people that are trying to lead you down a path that is not ultimately where your heart's trying to take you. Are the people that are trying to pull you away and or compete with you, or you're trying to compete with them, really the people that you should be around anyway? Remember the trailer that was heading toward us in the story I shared moments ago? I didn't have the time to focus. Listen, I didn't have time to focus on what the other cars were doing. It didn't matter to me what the other cars were doing. What mattered was my family in my car. I wonder how many times you get focused on what the other cars are doing in your life instead of focused on you and what's going on in your car at the moment. Because if you don't pay attention to what's going on in your car, then you are going to wreck your car, your life, your mission in life. If you and I continue to try to replicate that competition, we're just being a mirror image of other people instead of you being your unique self. I think we all have this secret sauce that I think life wants us to share. How many people, well, maybe let me ask it a different way. There are people in the world that have leveraged the wisdom of a lot of smart people. Tim Ferriss comes to mind. Tim Ferriss wrote a book called Tools for Titans. I highly recommend you get a copy of the book. Tools for Titans comes from podcast interviews that he did with, I don't know how many, hundreds of people that shared their wisdom with Tim. Then Tim took that wisdom and put it in book form. But if he would not have gone to those people to seek out their wisdom, then I would not have been a recipient of that wisdom through the book Tools for Titans. So again, sometimes you and I have to be proactive about finding the wisdom in people that can teach you things that you don't know. I'm not saying mirror them. I'm not even suggesting copying them. But taking lessons out of their lives that you can incorporate into your own package, into your own building, your own life, that can create a life that maybe you haven't imagined before or since. Ike Smith writes something that jumped out to me a long time ago, that he says the forms of competition mimic the possible paths of change. Listen, the forces that win create new truths, and you must decide how to maneuver to empower your truth. So you can either become weaker, equal, or stronger. That is you can even take the mistakes that other people have made and learn from their mistakes and save you from making the same mistakes. But I'll tell you flat out that doesn't happen unless you read good books about people and or watch interviews of people who've been there and done that. I'm telling you, if you think that you have to reinvent the wheel every decision you make or every task or every goal that you're trying to achieve? You don't have to. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. But you should learn from people who've built the wheel multiple times. I think so. But see, society begs you to fit in. Think about all the clothing styles that have gone on. When I was a kid, they had bell bottoms, which for those who don't know, I think they call them flares now. But bell bottoms were there's wide pants legs at the bottom, and long hair was in. My family had my hair always cut short, so it was not this quite short, but it was short, and I never fit in. But the culture wants you to fit in. The culture wants you to dress like everybody else. I have in my closet probably 100 neckties, but the neckties I have are wider. And just in the last year or two, now it goes back to thin ties that were popular years ago. So as of right now, I still have now those ties. I put them all in a trash bag and have them up on the top of the closet, because maybe those wide ties will come back and I don't have to buy new ties again. The point is that culture changes. So if you are consistently moving with the culture and changing with fashion, yeah, you got to fit in to some point. But for you to change your entire philosophy based on what society's doing, you're going to be left behind pretty quickly. Robert Dugan writes, "We Americans do not adequately appreciate the political process in our country. During the campaign, I often recounted a nightmarish 1938 incident as a way of contrast. A district party conference was underway in Moscow province in Russia. It was presided over by a new secretary of this committee, replacing the one that was recently arrested. At the conclusion of the conference, a tribute to Comrade Stalin was called for. Of course, everyone stood up, just as everyone had leaped to his feet during the conference with every mention of his name. The hall echoed with a stormy applause, raising to an ovation for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. The stormy applause rising to an ovation. It continued, but palms were getting sore and raised arms were already aching. And the older people were panting from exhaustion. It was becoming insufferably silly even to those who adored Stalin. However, who would dare be the first to stop? The secretary of the district party could have done it. He was standing on the platform, and it was he who had just called for the ovation. But he was a newcomer. He had taken the place of a man who'd been arrested. He was afraid. After all, these men were standing in the hall, applauding and watching to see who would quit first. And in the obscure small hall, unknown to the leader, the applause went on. 6 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, they were done for. Their goose was cooked. They couldn't stop now until they collapsed with heart attacks. At the rear of the hall, which was crowded, they could of course cheat a bit, clap less frequently, less vigorously, not so eagerly, but up there with the people up front, they had to clap loud and hard. The director of the local paper factory, an independent and strong-minded man, stood with those up front, aware of all the fakeness of the impossibility of the situation. He kept on applauding. 9 minutes, 10 minutes, in anguish, watched the secretary of the district party committee, but the latter dared not stop. Insanity. To the last man, we make-believe enthusiasm on their faces, looking at each other with faint hope. The district leaders were just going on and on, applauding until they were just about to fall out. But they were carried out in stretchers. And even then, those who were left would not falter. Then, after 11 minutes, the director of the paper factory assumed the business-like expression and sat down in his seat. And oh, a miracle took place. Where had the universal, uninhibited, indescribable enthusiasm gone? To a man, everyone else stopped dead and sat down. They had been saved. The squirrel had been smart enough to jump off his revolving wheel. That, however, was how they discovered who the independent people were, and that was how they went about eliminating them. They easily passed 10 years on him on the pretext of something quite different. But after he had signed Form 206, the final document of the interrogation, his interrogator reminded him, don't ever be the first to stop applauding. Think about that culture. I know that's an extreme example. It's a true story. But how many of you are still applauding, still doing stuff because everybody else is doing stuff? Instead of being your own person. Instead of being the first, instead of one of a bunch. That's the theme of the show here today. That you are unique, you are special, you were created to do certain things in a certain way. If you keep making the choice really to follow your coworkers and your neighbors, you're going to miss out on huge opportunities that life has set aside specifically for you. And there's a big hiccup that comes hand in hand with competition sometimes, and that's the envy of other people. You want to be like other folks. Getting inside your head sometimes is the job of, I'll use the term, the enemy. There's a story in the Bible in Matthew chapter 4, and it talks about how Jesus was raised by his parents, and at a relatively young age of 30 or so, he was called into what he was chosen to do in his life. But the story says that the devil came to him after a period of time and took him up into a mountain in Matthew chapter 4 and tempted him to do certain things that would either prove or disprove who he was, when it wasn't exactly the right time for Jesus to do the things that he was called to do. So this story, at least for me, tells me that sometimes there are going to be people in your life that are going to try to get you to do things that are not timely for you to do them at that moment, and or to make yourself look better than you are, or to inflate your own ego. How many times haven't you been around people that have tried to inflate your ego, that have tried to make you look like something that you're really not, to try to get you to fall on your face a little too often because you insert foot in mouth? Been there, done that. Notice that even at one of Jesus' lowest times, Jesus still had a foundation that didn't distract him from his priorities. If you and I decide to build a solid foundation in our own lives that won't distract us from our priorities, then times of temptation to follow the competition or society or the culture won't be so great. On the flip side, that when you and I don't have that foundation that's built on solid rock, then things will happen, earthquakes will happen in our lives that can get us off base. So the temptations in this story in Matthew 4 came in three different waves. I'm not going to get into the whole story because we're running out of time. But Jesus was hungry. The devil came to him when he was hungry and said, the story says that he since you're hungry, turn these stones to bread. Turn these rocks to bread. You're Jesus, you can do anything. Number two, the temptation came for Jesus to misuse his power. Stop a minute. You think, John, I don't have any power. Yes, you do. You have more power than you think you do. I have people that I know very well who misuse their power to get personal gain. And if you stop and think about it for just a minute, you know people in your life that misuse their power for personal gain. And number three, this task, this temptation that came to Jesus was going to have him potentially bypass a path that he needed to take. And sometimes there's going to be people in your life that are going to come to you and say, you can take the easier way because it's easier, but if you took the easier way, then you're going to miss so many of the good things that you would have achieved if you would have stayed on that, what's called the straight and narrow path, instead of taking those shortcuts that really end up taking you nowhere at all. So in this story in Matthew 4, Jesus came back with what was written, what was already in writing, to say that, you know what, this is my foundation. I'm not going to allow you, the devil, or people who are trying to tempt you to get you off base. So the way Jesus responded in this story, to me, is pretty powerful, because the distractions of the competition can pull you away from your path if you let it. Again, the distractions of the competition can pull you away from the path if you let it, but you don't have to let it, because you're in control of your life if you choose to take control of your life. So think about all these temptations to get off base, to allow society to pull you from one direction or another, that will say, you know what, if I take the easy way, then I can get there faster, maybe, or you can miss out on some of the biggest blessings in your life because you've chosen to give in to people and circumstances that really don't have your best interest at heart. So I'm asking you today to think about where you're headed, write down where you're headed, and be very clear where you want to end up. And don't always follow the society and the culture, because sometimes where they're going is not the direction you need to go. My name's John Carver, and I thank you so much for watching. We'll talk soon. Take care.